LAX airport was bustling on that Thursday in December 2012, but there was something different in the air, a barely perceptible energy that told of stories about to intertwine in ways no one could have predicted. Amid the hustling crowd, a figure walked unassumingly toward the first-class gate, carrying only a battered backpack and wearing a plain t-shirt, faded jeans, and worn-in sneakers. His tousled blonde hair and stubble made him look like any California surfer returning home from a weekend at the beach. Richard Blackstone adjusted the cuff of his Italian shirt for the third time in 5 minutes, eyeing the first-class line with growing irritation. As a vice president of one of the largest investment firms in Beverly Hills, Richard had built his entire identity on the premise that you are where you sit, what you wear, and how much your watch costs. His $40,000 Rolex Submariner caught the artificial light of the airport as he drummed his fingers impatiently against his Italian leather briefcase, waiting to board the flight to Miami, where he would close a deal that would net his company $15 million. When his eyes fell on the man in front of him in line, Richard felt a familiar mix of superiority and indignation. "That's the problem with airlines these days," he muttered to himself. "Anyone with a credit card thinks they can fly first class." The man in question seemed absorbed in a phone conversation, speaking in hushed tones about something to do with supply distribution and affected families, words that Richard interpreted as corporate jargon from some third-rate logistics company. Boarding began, and Richard watched with growing disdain as the man showed his ticket and gave the attendant a genuine smile, which she smiled back at with unusual warmth. Probably using accumulated miles, Richard thought. Or, worse, a last-minute promotion. When they finally boarded the plane, fate, or perhaps irony, placed the two men side by side in seats 1A and 1B. The casual-looking man settled in with economical movements, tucking his backpack under his seat and pulling out a well-marked book. Something about child psychology and trauma. Richard noted the simplicity of his belongings: a reusable water bottle, an old-fashioned cell phone, and none of the usual trappings that accompany first-class passengers. It was as if he were genuinely unaware that he was in an environment that cost 5 times as much as economy class. During takeoff, Richard decided to establish what he considered the natural order of things. "First time flying premium?" he asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The man turned, revealing blue eyes of startling intensity, and for a moment, Richard felt as if he were actually being seen, not just observed. "Not really," he replied in a voice that held a comforting quality, as if each word had been carefully chosen so as not to cause discomfort. "But I never get used to luxury. It always makes me wonder how many meals it could buy for families in need." The answer caught Richard off guard. It wasn't the submissiveness he'd expected, nor the defensiveness he'd anticipated. It was something worse. It was genuine sincerity, and it irritated him deeply. "Well, that's an interesting perspective," he said in a tone that suggested otherwise. "But some people work hard to enjoy certain things. That's just how the economy works." The man nodded thoughtfully, as if he had truly considered Richard's words. "You're right about working hard. I imagine your job demands a lot from you." There was something about the way he said it, without sarcasm, without judgment, that made Richard feel simultaneously validated and inexplicably uncomfortable. "It does," Richard replied, warming to the topic. "I move hundreds of millions in investments. People depend on my decisions for their financial futures. It's not a job for just anyone." He gestured vaguely toward the other man's simple belongings. "It takes a certain kind of dedication." "Dedication," the man repeated, savoring the word. "It's an admirable quality. It must be gratifying to know that your decisions impact so many lives." Again, there was no irony in the voice, just a genuine curiosity that Richard found simultaneously flattering and unsettling. As the flight progressed, Richard found himself in an odd situation. Every attempt to establish his superiority was met with genuine interest and thoughtful questions that, paradoxically, made him question his own motivations. When he mentioned his $200,000 car, the man asked if he enjoyed driving, or if it was mostly for status. When he talked about his house in Malibu, He was asked if he had time to really enjoy it. Richard's frustration grew with each interaction. "Look," he said finally, his patience wearing thin, "I don't want to sound rude, but it's obvious that we live in very different worlds. Some people are born to lead, to make important decisions, to be in charge. Others—" He glanced meaningfully at the man's plain attire. "Others have their roles as well." For a moment, something changed in the air between them. The man looked directly at him, and Richard saw something in his eyes that he couldn't quite place. Not anger, not hurt, but a depth that made him feel as if he were being measured by some standard he didn't recognize. "You know," the man said calmly, "I used to work on cars. I learned that more powerful engines sometimes make less noise than those that are being pushed too hard to prove a point." The analogy struck Richard in a way he hadn't expected, but before he could respond, the flight attendant approached with a special smile, the kind of recognition Richard was used to receiving, but which was clearly not directed at him. "Mr. Walker," she said with genuine warmth, "I hope you're comfortable. The captain wanted you to know that he watched Fast and Furious with his kids last week and would be honored to greet you upon landing." Richard's world stopped. Walker. Paul Walker. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with the devastating precision of a perfectly timed gear shift. The man sitting beside him wasn't some random passenger. He was one of the biggest movie stars in the world, the face of a billion-dollar franchise, someone whose films had been watched by hundreds of millions of people. And Richard had just spent the last hour trying to school him about success and leadership. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt the blood rush to his face as the reality of the situation crystallized. He had judged, belittled, and tried to humiliate someone who was not only more successful than he was, but who had responded to every provocation with a grace that now seemed monumentally humiliating by contrast. I didn't know," Richard stammered, his confidence evaporating like water on hot asphalt. Paul turned to him with the same calm smile he had worn throughout their conversation. "It's okay not to know who I am," he said gently, "but maybe there's a problem with deciding who someone is based on what you see on the outside." The words carried the weight of a truth Richard had never been forced to confront. He opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, to somehow undo the last 2 hours, but Paul continued. "You know, I've been very lucky in life, more than I deserve probably. But one thing I've learned is that what really matters isn't where you sit, or what you drive, or how much money you make." He gestured gently to the cabin around them. "It's what you do when no one's watching. It's how you treat people who can't do anything for you. It's whether you leave the world a little better or a little worse." Richard looked down at his own hands, the same ones that signed million-dollar contracts, commanded boardrooms, built a financial empire, and for the first time in years, he wondered what they had really built. "I spend so much time trying to prove my worth," he admitted, his voice lower than he expected, "that I think I've forgotten to ask what that worth is for." "It's easy to get lost in that," Paul replied with an understanding that seemed to come from personal experience. "The entertainment industry can be brutal that way. Everyone's trying to prove that they belong, that they deserve to be there. But in the end, the only opinions that really matter are those of the people you love and your own conscience when you look in the mirror." As the plane began its descent toward Miami, Richard watched Paul interact with other passengers and crew members. There was no pretense, no attempt to use his fame as social currency. He was genuinely grateful, asked questions about people's lives, remembered details of previous conversations. It was the behavior of someone who understood that his position in life was a privilege, not a right. After landing, as they waited to disembark, Paul turned to Richard one last time. "You mentioned that your decisions affect people's futures," he said. "That's a huge responsibility. I can only imagine how many lives you could positively touch if you applied that influence with the same energy you use to protect them." Richard nodded slowly, feeling something fundamental shift in his worldview. "May I ask what you were discussing on the phone earlier? About supply distribution?" Paul smiled, a little embarrassed. "My organization. When they're Our natural disasters, we send rescue teams. Haiti, the Philippines, Chile. We were organizing a shipment to a community that was hit by hurricanes. He paused. It's funny how you mentioned that some people are born to lead. I think we all are, in some way. The question is whether we lead for ourselves or for something bigger. As they got off the plane, Richard watched Paul quietly get approached by fans. There was something deeply human about the way he interacted with each person, not like a celebrity doing an obligation, but like someone genuinely interested in each encounter. One child asked for a photo, and Paul not only accepted but knelt down to her level, making her laugh before telling his mother to be careful on the way home. That night, alone in his 5-star hotel in Miami, Richard looked out the window at the ocean and thought back not just to the last few hours, but to the last few years of his life. He had built his success on the premise that the world was a zero-sum competition, that for him to win, others had to lose. But Paul Walker had shown him something different, that true power lies not in rising above others, but in lifting others up with you. 6 months later, Richard Blackstone did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He founded an investment fund focused on social impact startups, specializing in companies working in disaster relief and community development. When colleagues asked about the change in direction, he would simply say that he had learned that the most valuable return on any investment cannot be measured in dollars. Paul Walker never knew the lasting impact he had that December afternoon. Less than a year later, the world would lose his physical presence in a tragic accident, but his words continued to echo in the life of a man who learned that true class is not where you sit, but how you treat the people sitting next to you. The lesson remains. We judge based on appearances, but character is revealed in actions. And sometimes, the person who seems to have the least to prove is exactly the one who has the most to teach about what is truly worthwhile in life.